Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this special presentation on key provisions and Canadian market opportunities for U.S. businesses and the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, presented by Purolator International. One bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will be having a question and answer session at the end. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions at any time during the presentation simply by clicking on that Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today. We're going to be hearing from Paul Tessie. He is Senior Vice President for Purolator International. Paul has overall responsibility for leading the company as it strengthens its position as a provider of innovative logistics solutions, with a primary focus on shipments moving between Canada and the United States. And we'll be hearing from Michael Zobin. He is Director of Global Trade Consulting, Quebec and Atlantic Canada regions for Livingston International. Michael has more than 20 years of customs brokerage experience with a specific expertise in free trade agreement compliance management. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Zobin. Michael, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bob, for your kind words on that introduction, and a note of thanks to Supply Chain Brain for hosting this webinar. As well, thank you to all of you for joining us today for this USMCA webinar, where we will be discussing key provisions and Canadian market opportunities for US businesses. Our agenda today will have two key sections. I will be discussing issues and aspects of compliance within the new USMCA, and Paul will outline thoughts about commercial opportunities. If we can go to the next slide, please. We at Livingston value our strong relationship with Purolator International, as well as Purolator Inc., the parent company, and would like to thank them for having us join this webinar. Next slide. Before we dive into the core topic, I would like to start by taking a brief moment to introduce Livingston. For those of you who do not know us, Livingston has a singular goal when working with businesses to simplify trade and provide clarity in a world of trade complexity. We are the largest customs broker in Canada and the third largest entry filer in the United States. Over 300 customs specialists support 30,000 companies across 50 countries for customs brokerage and trade consulting. We have offices in more than 90 key border crossings, seaports, airports, and other strategic locations across North America. We maintain these facilities because we believe it is important to maintain a large branch network and ensure we have staff available locally to take action and provide assistance when needed in regions such as Mexico, Asia, and Europe. If we go to the next slide. We're all here to learn a little bit more about USMCA in the background. And the first thing we want to point out is you could hear a lot of different acronyms for this free trade agreement. There's USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. There's CUSMA, not to be confused with the power forward on the Los Angeles Lakers, but the CUSMA, Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. And then in Mexico, it's called TMEC. So all these different acronyms really refer to the exact same thing, but for consistency, we will be referring to the agreement as USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. At the onset, I want to point out that much of the agreement has remained the same. It has been maintained. In terms of qualifying your products to determine if they are eligible for the preferential treatment, about 80% of the rules of origin have remained unchanged. And what does this really mean for your business? There are two main tasks that should be undertaken, or we suggest that you review, that your companies ensure has been probably already taken, as the USMCA has been alive for the last month and change. The first one is to ensure that your goods are recertified to make sure that they continue to qualify. As an example, if the rules under NAFTA did qualify your good, and your goods qualified under those rules, any changes to those rules for the exact same product may take your product outside of being eligible for the USMCA. And also, and I think more importantly, sometimes you may not have qualified under NAFTA, but with these rule changes, it could now very well be qualified under the USMCA. So taking a closer look and recertifying your products is step one. And the other key point to look at is to renew your statement of origin. And we'll get to the more specifics about how to issue the certificate of origin. That's what we called it under NAFTA. Under USMCA, we refer to it as a statement of origin. So because the certificate that you issued from January till June is no longer valid, you can't just take the NAFTA certificate and say, here, this is the certificate for USMCA. So those are the two key main points. What you see now on the slide, some significant changes in terms of the rules, regional value content. Just to point out, a big misconception that we found here at Livingston is that you don't right away go to the regional value content in terms of qualification. There's also the tariff shift rule, and we won't get into the details of what that's all about. But take note that certifying your products isn't a simple calculation of how much value was added within the region. Specifically in the automotive sector, there's a new labor value content. One of the things we're going to focus on further in the presentation is increased market access. And how did that happen? How come all of a sudden certain US or we'll focus on certain US e-commerce businesses, how they've gained market access in Canada through this USMCA, the revised rules. And other things we'll touch upon is intellectual properties and digital trade. So all these things can, we will see how and provide information to you today on how this USMCA free trade agreement affects you and your business. If you go to the next slide. So we mentioned that there is a change in the process of how to issue the statement or certificate of origin. If we could go to the next slide. It's really interesting, the USMCA does not have a prescribed format. Under NAFTA, there was a very specific format called the Certificate of Origin that had to be completed, and really there was no deviance from that aspect of the Certificate of Origin. Under the USMCA, you could actually provide certain data elements, which we'll take a look at in a moment, in any format. And one of the suggestions we have is it could be right on your invoice on a shipment by shipment basis. And we will provide you with a link to a website where you could actually download a template of a statement of origin where the minimum data requirements are outlined for you. So really you could create your own template to ensure that you are following the information required to make sure that the minimum data requirements are provided when alleviating yourself or, and this sometimes is more important, your client to the preferential treatment under USMCA. Another aspect which we will look at in the digital section of this talk is that customs and the USMCA are allowing for electronic digital signatures. That's something new. It's really coming into the times of today where a lot of customs procedures, especially in Canada, forgive me Canada Customs, but are still archaic to a certain extent, and this provision of digital signature is really something that can provide benefits to businesses. And lastly, what I wanted to point out is under NAFTA, there were only two companies that could certify a product, the exporter or the producer. Under the regulations of USMCA, and this is very interesting, the importer can also complete the statement of origin, again, in whichever format they choose to do so. But it's very, a key point to note is the importer requires to have all the backup, and we'll touch upon the backup and document retention and record keeping policies in order for them to be able to make that statement. Another misconception that we deal with a lot here at Livingston is we speak to companies that have issued a certificate of origin under NAFTA or a statement of origin and signed the certificate, but didn't really take the time to understand and do the due diligence of what that signature means. So if an importer is certifying goods, they better be sure to have enough backup to substantiate to customs that they did their homework and ensuring that the goods do qualify. If we go to the next slide. So we won't go through each of the specific data elements, but two key aspects to note is that there's a new field that has to be completed, and that's the certifier. In other words, a declaration of who's certifying the goods, what we just spoke about. Is it the exporter, the producer, or the importer? And also the certification statement. There's an actual statement, and you could actually look this up in Annex 5A of Chapter 5 of the USMCA, but without boring you with those details, again, we'll give you a link to download a template where the statement can be found. But these are the minimum data requirements that have to be found somewhere on some document, whether it's the invoice, whether it's on company letterhead, dare to say even a napkin, but please don't quote me on that. It should be a little bit more formal, again, because of record-keeping responsibilities, which we will get to shortly. So these are the 11 data elements that have to be found somewhere in the documents being presented to alleviate the shipment for preferential treatments. If we can go to the next slide. And this is just a recap to see, under NAFTA, it was very simple. Certificate of origin, very, very concrete way and how the form looked that had to be adhered to. Under USMCA, it could be a statement of origin on any document. It could be completed by the importer as well as the exporter producer. There's no specific format. And the one thing I would like to mention is, in order to alleviate oneself of the preferential treatment, you must have the statement of origin or these 11 minimum data requirements somewhere on documents in order to declare the preferential treatment for shipments of 3,300 Canadian dollars or more. Now the question is, what happens to lower value shipments? And that's a great question. We'll get to that momentarily. If we go to the next slide, please. So now, just from a business perspective, to understand where do these rule changes who do they really affect? And what we wanted to do is give an overview, a very general, broad overview to demonstrate which industry verticals have significant changes. Now, some companies actually go for origin rulings with the customs authorities and may have rulings under NAFTA. It's really beneficial to understand if one should renew those rulings under the USMCA, whether it's with the Canadian Border Services Agency, aka Canada Customs, or US Customs and Border Protection. It's really important to understand what rulings you have on hand, when it might be applicable to go for a ruling, when it might be beneficial to go for a ruling. So with these industry verticals, when we mentioned that 80% of the rules remained unchanged, these are where the 20% of the changed rules will usually occur. Now, it's very important to note that it doesn't mean other HS codes and industry verticals have no changes, and you could just rely on this list to say, well, I'm not a part of this industry, I don't have to go and recertify my products. I think it's really important to review, in whichever industry vertical your products fall into, to review the rules of origin to ensure that there is compliance and that the goods still adhere to the rules and to have the preferential treatment for those goods. The one thing to mention, and this is really going into the meat and potatoes of certification of products, the de minimis, and I use that word cautiously now because we're going to use that word again very shortly. De minimis in terms of how much non-originating product can be used as inputs into the final product. Under NAFTA, it was 7%. Now, for the most part, with some exceptions, it's 10%. So that was one of the changes within the rules of origin. And again, please don't confuse the word de minimis that I'm using now with the de minimis that I'm going to be speaking of and that Paul will refer to later on in the presentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. In terms of digital trade, there are two things that I wanted to mention. Countries around the World Customs Organization, the World Trade Organization, is really looking into what happens when data is transmitted via the internet and it crosses a border. Is that dutiable. There's value to it. You could download a program and all of a sudden, you know, you don't have to buy a CD that's packaged up in a box anymore. You could download a program, and that program was written by somebody somewhere else in the world, and it's not a domestic quote unquote download. Well, under the USMCA, it prohibits customs duties on these types of downloads. So that's something to take into consideration, because there are some countries out there, I believe, and please don't quote me, somewhere in the EMEA region that are seriously looking at imposing duties when they have this download, and I still haven't found out or heard of how they will monitor that. But the USMCA protects companies from those types of duty impositions. Another aspect, as that we spoke about before, is the third one, where there is no restriction in the use of electronic authentication or electronic signatures. And I think from a trade facilitation perspective, this and digital commerce, these are two key aspects of things that are enabling your business. You don't have to walk over to a senior member of the executive to get a signature on the documentation any longer. Electronic signatures are acceptable, and it really makes the business more efficient and cost effective when you are undertaking the use of this preferential treatment USMCA. If we can go to the next slide, please. In terms of government verifications, I always tend to bring this up because nothing is as simple as it seems. We won't go through the whole process of how Canada initiates audits, but the one thing, in my opinion, the key thing to remember is if there is an audit that has been initiated, that interim report, that's the third arrow, to the third from the left, second from the right, do not ignore that. That is when importers have the capabilities of responding to the findings of customs. Customs are human, believe it or not, they are, and they do make mistakes. We have several examples of where we sat down with customs and very respectfully and politely noted of how they erred in their determination and at which time they agreed. So that is when, that interim report period is when to really have that conversation with customs. Keep that in mind, and if we go to the next slide, please. And of course, not to you know, put vinegar on a wound or scare anybody at this time. Like the US, Canada does have a penalty system. Canada Border Services does have a penalty system. At times, it's very minimal. At times, it could be excruciatingly painful for a business. So compliance is something to take a look at and to continue to be proactive in order to try and mitigate and hopefully eliminate any possible penalties that can be issued by customs. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to conclude, and there's that word de minimis again, you know, and this time de minimis, we're going to look at the value. It has not in terms of the content, how much content can be in a product that's not originating to adhere to the rules of origin. We're going to talk about the value. And one of the key changes to the USMCA versus NAFTA is that under NAFTA, goods valued at $20 or less were able to enter Canada without any sort of declaration under what we call the courier remission order. The US really made a point that Canada and Mexico had to raise that limit. So what Canada did, and this is how what the agreement is based on, this is one of the main points of the agreement in terms of the de minimis rule. Any shipment valued at $40 or less, so now double, there is no duties or tax in Canada. There's the goods and services tax or the harmonized sales tax, GST/HST. So any value $40 or less, there is absolutely no entry. That basically doubles the value. And between $40 and a penny to $150, there's no duty. Tax at 5% is still charged. Forgive me to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty, into the weeds. If it's a personal shipment, then tax could be up to 13% for the HST, depending on which province the goods are going to. So, but for the most part, the GST is 5%. So anything between $40 and $150, there's no duty, but tax is still charged. And if we look further down, shipments valued between $150 and $3,300. There's that $3,300 number again. That's where we have informal entries, and the benefits of that is the declaration can be made even after the goods arrive at their destination. Some final points to consider is that this de minimis is specific to to couriers. It's also, if you send shipments through the postal service, the de minimis rule remains at $20. It's specific for goods entering Canada that left USA or Mexico. So if you have the same item that is going to be shipped from the Orient to Canada, then the de minimis remains at $20. And I think Paul will expound on that, and the benefit is to see how to get goods from USA and Mexico up to Canada to utilize this rule to the fullest. The one word of caution, which is totally outlined, specifically outlined in the regulations on the Canada Border Services website, is one cannot split shipments in order to avail themselves of this duty-free and tax-free benefits. So just to end off, we go to the next slide, please. You have to make sure that you understand the rules of USMCA. We want to make sure that, as I said, you're soliciting the proper documents and not using the NAFTA documents that were provided in the beginning of 2020. And in terms of compliance, the record keeping, so there's what I mentioned, we're going to speak about record keeping number 7 at the top right. To keep records is imperative as a taxpayer, as an importer. It's not if you're going to get audited, it's when. And as well, number 10, have that communication internally. I've seen and heard and been a part of horror stories where we had to untangle decisions made by one team within an organization and then didn't take into consideration the ramifications for the other team. So communicate internally to ensure that everybody understands what the USMCA is all about. And finally, the next slide. These are the web links. If you'd like to take a look at the web links in order to be able to download the templates of the certificate of origin and other key insights of the USMCA agreement, Livingston has those websites available, those items available on their website for anyone who would like to take a look. I once again want to thank you for joining us today, and at this time I'm going to turn it over to Paul Tessie.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, for that overview. North American free trade agreements only come along every 25 years or so, so I bet it's been quite an exciting time for you and the Livingston team. Let's start with a quick overview of the company. We've been spending, as Purolator, a lot of work since the agreement was announced back in 2018, diving into some of the details and implications. But I'd like to do a quick intro of Purolator. Purolator is a leading provider of cross-border logistics solutions for shipments moving between the US and Canada. Much of our work is focused on helping businesses, both B2B and B2C, with supply chain operations or customer bases in the Canadian market. Our customer needs extend to almost every sector, everything that you can possibly imagine. So auto parts suppliers that need to meet precise Canadian manufacturing facility delivery windows, apparel companies with physical stores located in Canada, industrial equipment that needs to be delivered to the oil and gas companies located in the remote northern territories of Canada, medical companies and time and temperature sensitive shipments that need to be delivered as soon as possible to hospitals and laboratories and clinics, and of course, e-commerce shipments, and lately, lots and lots of e-commerce shipments. So if you can imagine it, we've probably delivered it. And while each solution requires a unique transportation distribution components, we must also take a look into account the unavoidable customs process. We take a long, hard look at our customers' customs responsibilities and try to determine how shipments can more efficiently navigate the process. So we really take, of course, with compliance, a commercial lens. Next slide, please. So as we consider some of the opportunities available through USMCA, I want to point out that some of these provisions are more applicable to B2C businesses that primarily ship lower value e-commerce shipments directly to the Canadian consumers' homes, while other provisions may be more relevant for business to business. So regardless of whether you're B2C or B2C focused though, the USMCA includes relevant provisions for all types of businesses. And while duties and taxes are paid by importers, not exporters, they directly impact the exporters' competitiveness in the Canadian market and are therefore top of mind for many of you who currently export to Canada or are considering doing so. Next slide, please. So, as Michael mentioned, duties and taxes are unavoidable parts of international trade, but there's no reason for a business to pay more than it has to. So we take great pride in thinking out of the box and optimizing, identifying options for minimizing businesses' obligations in these areas, which will then help enable growth. First, and this is pretty straightforward, are potential tax and duty savings for low-value shipments arriving in Canada via an express carrier. Canada's de minimis threshold as of July 1st, as Michael mentioned, is increased from 20 to 40 and now up to 150 Canadian dollars for duties. This means a consumer in Toronto can now order a $125 pair of boots from LL Bean, for example, and not have to worry about customs duties, as long as the shipment arrives via an express carrier that is registered under the Courier Imports Remissions Order, or what we call CIRO. This is a significant win for U.S. e-commerce businesses, and the International Trade Commission did some modeling and is estimating that the increase in e-commerce sales to the Canadian market, once settled, will increase trade by $332 million, and that's pretty material, and that's opportunity for all companies. In fact, negotiators had the thriving e-commerce market when they started the negotiations on the de minimis threshold. The U.S. team in Washington actually wanted to expand the opportunities for online sales into Canada, and they originally sought to raise that Canadian de minimis to $800, which, as many of you know, is currently the U.S. inbound threshold. Well, they didn't get to the 800, so they weren't successful, but they did end up with the $40 threshold for taxes and $150 for duties, which still is a great opportunity for northbound shipping. Next slide, please. So while e-commerce may have been the key driver behind the de minimis increase, all qualified shipments can benefit. So this includes, for example, a B2B company that may have shipments of small parts that fall below the threshold. However, the de minimis change is only applicable to express shipments. Depending on your business, the average cost of shipments, and your volume going into Canada, you may want to reconsider your shipping strategy. But be aware that, as Michael mentioned again, if shipments are arriving via the postal customs clearance process via the UPU, so if you're tendering volume to the USPS and then via the UPU, the Universal Postal Union, those volumes are going to Canada Post. Those do not enjoy the benefits. So you might want to rethink changing your supply chain. By using an express carrier, that amounts just to $150. So you allow Canadian consumers to avoid paying duties, which makes transactions less expensive, and this really builds goodwill among your customers, your consumers, and makes your businesses more competitive in the Canadian market and really puts you on a level playing field with Canadian businesses. There are several businesses that only operate in the US, have an online strategy, and have a very substantial market share in the Canadian market. Next slide, please. This is an interesting one. The increased de minimis also provides an incentive to increase the number of SKUs offered on your Canadian website, because in doing so, you will address what has become a common complaint among Canadian consumers. They want choice. And it has been the tendency of US businesses to limit product selections on their Canadian sites. So there's really no reason for that. We found out that one of our US apparel retailers actually found out the hard way. They launched their Canadian website, put a lot of money into marketing with great fanfare, and they timed it to coincide also with the opening of one of their Canadian retail stores. And they thought they had done all their homework, but they were really surprised to find out that there was backlash from Canadian consumers. The savvy Canadian consumers were were rather annoyed to find out that the products listed on the US websites of those retailers were not being offered in Canada. And really, there's really no reason for that nowadays. So needless to say, the retailer was, in that case, was forced to issue an apology, make the necessary adjustments, and really open up their entire SKU base to the Canadian market. So now with the change of the Canadian de minimis threshold, retailers have an added incentive to increase the number of products that are offered that will qualify for duty-free status. And that really includes opening up all their shipping locations in the US, really opening them up, enabling them for northbound shipping to Canada. Next slide, please. So businesses with low value shipments can also take advantage of expanded expedited clearance opportunities. The agreement allows shipment valued at less than $3,300 to clear customs as informal entry. The actual declaration may occur after the goods reach their destination, meaning there's a little concern of shipping delays, but the record keeping and certain documentation requirements still must be maintained for these shipments. You should be aware that CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, does indeed pay close attention to value shipments during various audit processes, and this increased focus could lead to penalties if compliance is not adhered to. Next slide, please. Okay, so this increase in the threshold means Canada will allow additional shipments to be delivered without a formal entry and declaration process. But again, the entry declaration process could take place well after the shipment has been delivered in Canada. So even after delivery, customs paperwork may still be required, as well as adherence with certain record-keeping requirements. There are some time-saving measures under USMCA that can help facilitate these requirements. For one thing, the statement of origin does not have to be provided at the time of clearance in order to benefit USMCA's preferential duty treatment. However, Canadian customs officials will expect there to be supporting documentation prepared and available upon request. Although this provision of USMCA facilities facilitates the entry process for qualified low-value shipments, I can't overstate the importance of full compliance and good record keeping. The Canadian government is very serious about this, and just a few years ago in 2017, the Canadian Auditor General made several recommendations to CBSA about improving compliance and record keeping. And now with the USMCA in place, shippers must take care to ensure that all documentation and records are in place. Next slide, please. Okay, PGAs, Canada's partner government agency. A new formal entry provision may also appeal to businesses that ship products that require approvals by government agency that go beyond the regular customs requirements. In Canada, CBSA acts on behalf of these legal entities. That's what we're calling PGAs. Previously, you probably knew them as OGDs or other government departments. There are more than a dozen such agencies, including Health Canada, which has oversight on pharma and medical devices, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which oversees all food, plant, animal imports, and Transportation Canada, for example, which has jurisdiction over vehicles and tires. Each PGA has its own documentation and work requirements, and suffice to say, no product will be cleared for entry in Canada until all PGA requirements have been satisfied. Because of the extra steps required, these products are not eligible for courier low value program. Under NAFTA, we would typically recommend that a business have all shipments PGA and non-PGA clear customs together under Canada's regular clearance system, which is called the pre-arrival review system, or commonly known as PARS. This is because the de minimis threshold is set just at $20 in the past. It really wasn't worth the hassle to distinguish between PGA and non-PGA, and now it is. Next slide, please. So this is quite relevant. Now, though, it makes sense for businesses to reevaluate their shipping strategies if they are selling both PGA and non-PGA required products. Depending on your situation, you could ship PGA orders through PARS, but for separate orders of products that don't need PGA approval, they're valued less than $150, you can do a break and you may be eligible for that new de minimis threshold, resulting in duty and tax savings. So you may want to ship these products by express carrier to qualify under that new requirement. So it really takes, customers really and prospective customers to take a look at their products at a deep level. So I want to stress though, this option is only available in situations where your PGA and non-PGA shipments are separate from each other. You cannot split a shipment just to get the de minimis benefits. So there are many gray areas here in general, but PGA and non-PGA shipments must be entirely separate with unique purchase orders and transaction history. So again, that's where the consultation comes up. Purolator and Livingston would be happy to work with you on these potential opportunities. Next slide. Okay, so for a B2C shipper, making this determination would be a pretty cut and dried proposition. A customer's order either contains products that need PGA or doesn't. If it does, it's not eligible for the de minimis savings. But for a B2B shipper, the situation, as I mentioned, may be different. I can imagine a situation in which a company needs to express ship a replacement part into Canada to fix a broken piece of equipment, and assuming that part does not require any PGA approvals and it is valued less than $150, it will likely qualify for this de minimis benefit. So anyway, separated PGA and non-PGA shipments could be beneficial under the expanded de minimis threshold. Next slide, please. All right, so just to wrap up here, Michael and I are here today on behalf of our two companies, Livingston International Customs Brokers and Purolator International Logistics Solutions. Together, we represent two of the best names in Canada cross-border shipping. I hope you'll draw on our expertise and allow us to review your Canadian business strategy, which will, in fact, help enable more growth for your companies. Okay, so at this time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw it back to Bob Bowman to manage the Q&A.
Hey, thank you very much. Audience members, once again, even as we're doing this Q&A, are encouraged to keep submitting questions through that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will address as many of them as we can, time permitting. Let's start out with just a real quickie here of clarification. Michael, we've been asked to specify whether the dollar amounts that you're talking about are US dollars or Canadian. Could you clarify that, please?
Sure, it's Canadian dollars. So it's very important to watch the exchange rate. From memory, I think it's around $1.30 Canadian to $1 US. So be careful if you buy something in US dollars. You have to make sure that you're looking at the exchange rate to make sure that the goods are valued in Canadian at the various thresholds. So under 40 Canadian dollars, under 150 Canadian dollars, under 3,300 Canadian dollars. And that's, thanks for the question. And to clarify, yes, in Canada, we always have to look at the Canadian dollar value.
Very important to clarify that. Thanks a lot, Michael. Okay, here's a question I think goes out to Paul. I was interested in your suggestion that businesses might add more SKUs to their website listings with products that fall below Canada's de minimis threshold. But how could I do that without incurring additional warehouse and distribution costs?
Okay, thanks for the question. So I'm sure many e-commerce businesses share that concern. There's good news on that front. So US businesses have been pleasantly surprised to learn that e-commerce sales to Canada no longer require a physical presence in that country. So logistics solutions have become much more efficient and technology-based, such that businesses are able to fulfill Canadian orders online directly from the US with deliveries into Canada that meet customer expectations. Speaking from my own experience, Purolator International is able to have e-commerce shipments delivered into Canada usually several days faster than many of our competitors. And that's because of our really unique relationship with our parent company, Purolator Inc. Among other things, once an e-commerce shipment arrives in Canada, depending upon its size and final destination, it may also be delivered by Canada Post, giving might be a little bit more deferred, but really give a very efficient and economical solution for e-commerce delivery. And we also leverage our parent company's network in Canada with Canada Post.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. This one for Michael. The suggestion about separating PGA and non-PGA shipment would, I think, apply to my B2B business. While I'd love to reap the benefits, I think it sounds a little complicated. Could you shed a little more light on that?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's complicated. 100%, like the person who asked the question states, it is complicated because there is a rule where you cannot split shipments in order to alleviate oneself of these preferential treatments. And, you know, to give an answer on the spot right now would be difficult, but I'll give you one case scenario where I reached out through an association up here in Canada and give the following example. Let's say you had 200 or 300 locations across Canada, and the parent company, the head office, issued a PO to the vendor in the United States, so a business such as yourself, and then asked them to ship one of each one. So they ordered one item 300 times, and they said, ship this to 300 locations. The response I received was because that order was done all at once under one PO, then it would not fall under the de minimis of $40 or $150 because the order was in its thousands. So really, can you take that response that I received and apply it to your business? I think it's a guide, but every business case, and this is how I define my role, I take a business plan, I take customs regulations, and we merge it to make sure that you're in compliance. So I think that the best thing to do would be to reach out privately, whether it's to Paul or myself or both of us, to really understand how you're doing business, how your e-commerce portal is set up, and then we could determine how the best way that is for you and your business to take advantage of these new regulations and alleviate oneself of these preferential treatments and the de minimis rule.
Thanks very much, Michael. Paul, this question is going to take you out of the weeds a little bit for a little higher view, but a very important question to ask. And it is this: my company has not yet started to market to Canada, but we want to take advantage of the new trade agreement. What advice would you have for us with regard to getting started and understanding what our customs responsibilities would be?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest piece of advice I would have is take the plunge. Canada is worth it. Many US retailers and companies have had tremendous success shipping into Canada. The language is similar. It's an affluent country with a very wealthy country. You know, and I think right now with this new USMCA and this, you know, all the topics we're covering, the timing has never been better. The other trend I'll bring up here, which is a kind of like a color, in the past few months, we've actually seen several businesses contact us about bringing some of their supply chain operations back from Asia and China specifically as a way to reduce risk. So, you know, that's one of the things that I think is with reshoring is going on right now. And this would be a great opportunity for those companies that maybe were shipping on sea freight from China into Canada to relook at their supply chain for Canada and take a look at exactly how competitive it is shipping on the ground network or on the air networks into Canada. So you got a number of, you know, with regards to reviewing the opportunity, the U.S. commercial service website offers extensive materials as well for U.S. businesses, including detailed guides about, you know, the plus and minuses of exporting up to Canada. Another resource also would be your state government, which I'm sure has a lot of information about trade relationship with Canada. And of course, you know, the two companies that are hosting this webinar, Purolator and Livingston, with tons of experience for many years shipping northbound, you know, we'd be delighted to, you know, give you advice and, you know, kind of jump into what your strategies and objectives are of moving into the Canadian market. And we can give you that advice because we've seen every industry sector be successful in northbound shipping, so we could probably offer quite a lot of advice.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to direct this next one to Michael. What if the order is a partial? Does the de minimis still apply overall or still per shipment?
Well, I think we touched upon that in the previous response, whereas it's a great question. And if you start shipping partially when you receive one PO from the customer up in Canada, that could very well be a problem where you're circumventing regulations. But I think on a case-by-case basis, where sometimes even us at Livingston reach out to customs through our contacts there, we could determine the best way forward when you do have to split a shipment, whether because you're waiting for inventory or whatever the reason may be. So it's something that's a gray area and should be looked at very carefully before undertaking and utilizing the preferential treatment to ensure that you're not circumventing any regulations.
Thanks a lot. Here's another question of clarification. I'll direct it to Paul, just in terms of, does UPS not count as an express carrier in the sense of DHL or FedEx is one? How do you define that?
Yeah, all of them are part of the express industry, and they're all express carriers, UPS, DHL, FedEx. So yes, they are also express carriers, correct.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And then for Michael, if my client is importing fruit samples from Mexico through a courier, how does CUSMA affect that?
Well, it's a great question, and that's what Paul touched upon in terms of PGA or previously referred to as other government departments. Fruit samples, you might require licenses depending if they're fresh fruit or dried fruit. Definitely might need not definitely might, but will need a CFIA review to see what requirements are needed from a Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA. So in terms of how CUSMA affects that, how the USMCA affects that, it's really, I believe, just a really quick answer, 30,000 feet. What Paul mentioned, when you require other government departments or PGAs to be involved with the clearance, then unfortunately, for the most part, you can't utilize the preferential de minimis rules where the goods could just cross the border without any duties, taxes, or declarations. So it's A, to classify the product with the proper HS codes, B, to look at any requirements from the PGA, specifically in this case, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and if there's no requirements, then it might actually be possible to get those goods in under the de minimis rules. But if there are requirements, then would have to go through a more formal process. It's a great question, and again, every business and every business case and scenario should be reviewed in detail to ensure compliance.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. At this point, we're going to wrap it up. If we did not get to any audience questions, I'm sure our speakers would be more than happy to answer them offline. But in the meantime, I want to thank Paul Tessie from Purolator International, Michael Zobin from Livingston International, and our audience for listening in to this vital and informative and extremely well-timed presentation on USMCA and doing business and shipping in Canada. Thanks to everyone for being here. Everybody stay well and have a great day.